Hello students, this is Divya Kumari Meena. Let us continue the story A Cup of Tea written by Katherine Mansfield. Today it was a little box. He had been keeping it for her. He had shown it to nobody as yet. As Mrs. Rosemary was a very rich woman, therefore she used to purchase things from the expensive markets. In a shop, a shopkeeper kept a little box in front of Mrs. Rosemary, and he showed it to her as if he has secured it for her. An exquisite little camel box with a case. So fine it looked, as though it had been backed in cream. On the lid a minute creature stood under a flowery tree, and a more minute creature still had her arms round his neck. This is the description of the beautiful box. The art which was done upon the cover of that box. Her head really no bigger than a geranium petal hang from a branch. It had green ribbons, and there was a pink cloud like a watchful cherub floating above their heads. Rosemary took her hands out of her long gloves. She always took off her gloves to examine such things. Yes, she liked it very much. She loved it. It was a great ducky. She must have it, and turned the creamy box, opening and shutting it. She couldn't help noticing how charming her hands were against the blue velvet. The shopman, in some dim cavern of his mind, may have dared to think so too, for he took a pencil, leaned over the counter, and his pale, bloodless fingers crept timidly towards those rosy, flashing ones, as he murmured gently, "If I may venture to point out to Madam, the flowers on the little lady's bodice." The shopkeeper showed a little artistic box to Rosemary, and Rosemary really loved that beautiful box, and she watched it and she surveyed it very keenly. Charming Rosemary admired the flowers, but what was the price? For a moment the shopman did not seem to hear. Then a murmur reached her. 28 guineas, madam. And when the shopkeeper showed her some flowers, Rosemary replied and admired those flowers, and she said that those flowers are very charming, and she asked about the price of that flower, and then the shopkeeper replied that the flowers cost 28 guineas. 28 guineas. Rosemary gave no sign. She let the little box down. She buttoned her gloves again. 28 guineas. Even if one is rich, she looked vague. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the shopman's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, "Well, keep it for me, will you?" "I will." And when the shopkeeper told about the price, Mrs. Rosemary was eagerly ready to purchase that little box and those flowers, and she asked the shopkeeper to keep it for her. But the shopman had already bowed, as though keeping it for her was all any human being could ask. He would be willing, of course, to keep it for her forever. The shopkeeper was already ready to give that piece of art to Rosemary. The discreet door shut with a click. When Rosemary went out the shop, there was the sound of the door was heard. She was outside on the step, gazing at the winter afternoon. When she was outside, she was moving outside the shop, and when she was on the stairs, she looked at the weather. Rain was falling, and with the rain, it seemed the dark came too, spining down like ashes. At the time the rain started, and because of the rain, darkness was appeared there. There was a cold, duster taste in the air, and the new lighted lamps looked sad. This is the description of the weather. Just because of the cold, the taste of the dust was there in the air. One could smell the dust in the air because of the rainfall, and the lights were also looking sad just because of the rainy season. She said were the lights in the houses opposite. Dimly they burned as if regretting something, and people hurried by, hidden under their hateful umbrellas. And on that day, the people were hurried to save themselves from rain. Rosemary felt a strange pang. She pressed her muff against her breast. She wished she had the little box to cling to. Of course, the car was there. She would only to cross the pavement, but still she waited. When it was raining, Rosemary stood outside the shop just because of the rain. There are moments, horrible moments in life, when one emerges from shelter and looks out, and it is awful. One oughtn't to give way to them. One ought to go home and have an extra special tea. But the very instant of thinking that a young girl, thin, dark, shadow, where had she come from, was standing at Rosemary's elbow, and a voice like a sigh, almost like a sob, breathed, "Madam, may I speak to you a moment?" At that very moment, a little girl came to Rosemary. Her voice was very sad, and it seemed that as if she was weeping. And in that very sadful tone, she asked Rosemary to speak something. "Speak to me," Rosemary turned. She saw a little battered creature with enormous eyes, someone quite young, no older than herself, who clutched at her coat collar with reddened hands and shivered as though she had just come out of the water. Rosemary turned towards that girl and asked, "Are you want to speak to me?" The little girl had big eyes and she was too young. She was not older than Rosemary and she holded the collar of Rosemary's coat and she was shivering, she was trembling just because she was wet. "Madam," stammered the voice. In the trembling voice, she said, "Madam, would you let me have the price of a cup of tea?" And in a shivering voice, she demanded for the price of a cup of tea.